Right, I'm here with Professor William Epstein. He is Professor of the School of Social Work at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, where he teaches social welfare policy. He's the author of 7 books, according to Amazon anyway, covering
Nine.
Nine. Author of 9 books covering the politics, economics and sociology of American social welfare, and 2 of which are of particular interest to us today. The first being The Illusion of Psychotherapy from 1995, I think, and the second being Psychotherapy as Religion, the Civil Divine in America. I think that one's from 2006. Dr. Epstein, welcome to the podcast. Did I get all that right? Did I get all that right? Missed anything out? Or
Yeah, that was okay.
Yeah, it's a bit of a common thing, apparently. So a lot of universities are a bit kind of slow to update the websites. So the most common mistake I make on this podcast is I introduce people, and because all the information I get is from the university website, and then it's like, no, that's not me anymore. I don't do that. I don't teach that. So we're off to a good start. Okay, so very interesting one this today, and it might sort of feel a bit out of left field for some people, and it's sort of influenced by came about as an episode we did maybe 3 or 4 episodes a day. Dr. John Crombie, we talked about the power and responsibility in mental health, and it was based on the work of David Smale, and through David Smale I've discovered you. And so the premise, I think the title of this episode is going to be Why Psychotherapy Doesn't Work, which in itself is going to be, a controversial title, and it'll get a lot of people's interest. And I think, just to give, before we go into a little bit about you, I just want to give listeners a little idea of what we're dealing with here. And so these are just the little brief summaries of the 2 books that we're focused on. So I haven't actually read these books. They're very expensive over here in Amazon in the UK, so I wasn't able to get hold of a copy, but I've done my best. So these are just even these little summaries are fascinating. So in The Illusion of Psychotherapy, William Epstein asserts that psychotherapy is probably ineffective and possibly harmful. He maintains that there is no credible clinical evidence that psychotherapy is effective in handling personal or social problems, or that it is more effective than any other modes of treatment. The theories that underpin clinical practice remain speculative, and their influence over social policy are more ideological than scientific. And then the second one in Psychotherapy as Religion, William Epstein sets out to debunk claims that psychotherapy provides successful clinical treatment for a wide range of personal and social problems. He argues that the practice is not a science at all, but rather the civil religion of America, reflecting the principles of radical self-invention and self-reliance deeply embedded in the psyche of the nation. So, like I say, William, I read those summaries, and it was like, I've got to speak to this guy. So we're going to pass through those some of the issues raised there. But first, before we do that, as always, if you could just tell us a little bit about you and your history, particularly the development of your personal interest in this subject, and why it appealed to you, why you decided to study in it.
Oh, it's my background is. My background is as a community organizer. I came into social work having done a couple of years of rural community development in South America. I worked in the poverty program in the 1960s. I worked in Washington for quite a few years as in the around community health services. Then I went and I got a doctorate in social welfare, and since then, I think that was a mistake. And I ended up teaching. And I was teaching a course in the School of Social Work and Research. My brother, who passed away this past year, my brother's a psychiatrist. And I was teaching a research course to clinicians, basically students who wanted to become therapists, clinical social work they wanted to go into. So I said to Paul, do you have any summary of the outcome research? And what he did was he sent me a copy of Smith, Glass, and Miller's article, which preceded their book, The Benefits of Psychotherapy, which was published in 1980. And I read it over, and it was probably the first meta-analysis ever conducted. And I thought that they had made all sorts of mistakes. So I went back to the basic literature, and that's where the critique started. There was no credible evidence. They found enormous benefits, and as I went over the literature and saw all the methodological mistakes that are made, actually methodological biases, my interest started that there was nothing that demonstrated the effectiveness of psychotherapy. That's where my interest started. But my writing and my interest is not precisely in psychotherapy. It's more a social critique, nature of society and stuff like that. And what I did was I went through the window that psychotherapy offered into the nature of the society. All the comments that you made from the blurbs of the book about heroic individualism being underneath of it, the broader concept is the concept of romanticism, classical continental philosophy. It's 19th century romanticism is at the heart of American social welfare preferences. By the way, my most recent book was the title was "The Masses Are the masses are the ruling classes," and what it shows is, what it argues, is that elites don't control the United States. Elites are the victors in the competition for popular values. It's popular values which run the United States, and those popular values are conservative, romantic values having to do with self-invention, personal responsibility. People create themselves, therefore they're responsible for themselves, and a belief in superstition, not in good scientific information, but in intuitive internal information. And the third principle being the United States and individuals are God's people. There's a sense of exceptionalism and chosenness. And this dominates American thought and always has dominated American thought. There's a powerful but small leftist tradition in the United States, a progressive tradition, but it doesn't dominate it and rarely expresses itself. And the book was written before Trump's election, and it explains Trump's election.
Right. Okay. So, I mean, there's plenty for us to sort of pass out and get our teeth into there. I guess sort of staying in the past for a minute. You mentioned that, like, right from the beginning, you involved in social work. So even before that, have you always had a sort of, I mean, even as a kid, as a teenager in high school, has there always been a family thing, maybe an interest in society or in charity, altruistic endeavours? What's the real genesis of it?
Well, all my grandparents were immigrants from Russia, and all of them had leftist commitments. Right. The whole family. My aunt was a prominent communist in the United States. The family wasn't communist; it was democratic socialist. She was way past that. But the whole family, the decisive experience in Europe, and then the Great Depression in the United States, and the difficulty of being an immigrant here. My father was in the Union, a very strong Union tradition, and all the children were raised in that.
Right. Okay. So, okay, let's jump into this now. So, I mean, before we get to all the higher level, the policy stuff, and the like you were saying, this idea of, you know, popular values is what really runs America. I just want to sort of dig into this critique of psychotherapy first.
Okay.
So let's take a quote from The Illusion of Psychotherapy, one of which is, it says, "Today there is not one credible study conforming to the basic rules of objective proof that testifies to the effectiveness of any psychotherapeutic treatment." Now, I mean, that's it's it's a big statement, but I have to say it's from. I mean, the book was first released in 1995, so I mean that's over 20 years ago, and then Psychotherapy is Religion, that was released 12 years ago. So I'm just wondering, how well that claim has aged. You know, is it still the case that there's no credible evidence testifying to the proof, the effectiveness of psychotherapy?
I'll be finished with my current book in a few months, and I'll be looking for a publisher. The title of the book is Soothing Fictions, the Social Clinic in the United States. And that's, I want to go past the term psychotherapy, so I speak about the social clinic. The heart of the social clinic is talk therapy in the United States. Yes, that claim keeps up. Occasionally there's a small sample study, but nothing's ever replicated. But the field has come to say that, well, it's adapted to the criticisms in a way. So studies are routinely done with randomized controls, but routinely, but it's not the dominant form. Anything that's not a randomized control, I don't know why people do them anymore. Because if you don't have a randomized control, a non-treatment control that's exactly like the treatment group, then you can't explain maturation or natural changes, natural remission. So you must have a non-treatment control. The great departure from the gold standard, if you will, is that the controls tend to be non-treatment waitlist controls. And there's attrition in the waitlist and there's attrition in the experimental group, and that distorts the comparisons. Not only that, but it's delayed treatment waitlist, which means that at the end of treatment, the waitlist is treated. Therefore, you have no comparison group for follow-up. I haven't even started going into the biases and the kinds of games that are played around explaining nutrition. But for these, so if you're going to review the literature in any area, you'll only take a look at randomized controls. There are hardly any placebo controls. Occasionally there's one, but there's always the question, what's the placebo? So you're dealing with, from the beginning, very weak research, even if it's randomized.
Okay, sorry, William. If I can just interject there, because you see, my audience are always going to consist of sort of people in the know and people that have got sort of no prior knowledge. So I think a good way to maybe put some meat on the bones of this, to explain like the methodology behind a study. I was just wondering, have you got any studies that you can think of off the top of your head, even if you don't know the exact figures, but with roundabout figures, which are sort of testament to this idea of having a flawed methodology?
It's all of them. What I did was I could go back if I bring up a chapter and go through it with you, but I took three dominant areas in psychotherapy. I took trauma studies, depression studies, and addiction studies. I went to the meta-analyses, which are summaries of the best of the research, and I took from them what they considered to be the very best of the very best research, and I pulled them apart. The very best of the very best research up to 2017 is extremely deficient. On top of that, there are certain kinds of biases which are jaw-dropping. There have been a series of studies which has demonstrated that when you put a statistician among the authors, the effect sizes, in other words, the degree of success is reduced by almost 50%. Another study compared outcomes by people within the field as opposed to people outside of the field conducting the study. Again, the bias is almost 50%. This is just from authorship. And then you've got the patients should be blind as to what group they're in. That's very difficult. But what's even more powerful than that, important, is that the evaluator should be blind to the assignment, and the evaluators aren't. Very frequently, the author of the research is doing the evaluation of the intervention. which is very inappropriate. It's just endless biases. For example, when attrition takes place, the current rule is intention to treat. All attrition, this is the rule in the field, not my rule, all attrition should be considered a failure. Well, the researcher has a choice in how you handle intention to treat. Let's take depression. A patient got into the study because they were depressed. They scored high on the depression scale. So do you bring forward the first score of the patient, or do you bring forward the last score of the patient? The tendency in the research is to bring forward the most recent score. Why that? Because any patient going into therapy, and particularly depressed patients, are very optimistic about getting cured, and they tend to report initially in therapy less depression. So if they bring that forward, it's a tribute to depression, but they dropped out, which usually means that they were depressed or disappointed or whatever. Skepticism says you bring forward the first score, not the most recent score. What others do is they impute a score. In other words, they take patients who didn't drop out, that are like the patient who did drop out, and they give them that score. But you shouldn't do that because there's a difference in the two groups. One stayed and one dropped out. This is not prudent skepticism. Another example that's even worse, if you will. There are two prominent scales that are used for depression. There's the Beck Depression Inventory and the Hamilton Scale. The Hamilton Scale is done by interview. A therapist interviews the patient. The Beck Depression Inventory is frequently done as a checklist by the patient. The checklist scores, the patient by themselves, are always worse than the Hamilton interviews. Why? Because they're reporting to a therapist and they're grateful for the free. In other words, they should be reporting the same, but they don't report the same. This is ostensible evidence of researcher bias.
So, I mean, bearing all this in mind, is there a method of conducting these studies which is a viable way of getting truthful results that you can think of? And if so, why is that not being implemented?
I'll answer both. The answer to the first is yes and no. There's an ideal form of conducting research, but it probably can't be achieved because I'm not sure whether an appropriate placebo can ever be designed. That being said, there are a couple of things which can be done that would produce more credible results. The first and most important thing is that the researchers need to be neutral. And it's the most important consideration. They cannot be therapists. Maybe the therapist can design it, but they cannot conduct the research.
Okay.
That is almost never done. Let me underline, that is almost never done. It is absurd, given the demonstrable biases in the field and the sloppiness of research and the partial reporting of data and the ambiguity as to what it means to allow the people with the greatest stakes in the outcome to conduct the research and to take the measures of patients. It is absurd. But this goes back to speak about the stakes in therapy and why government agencies composed of very sophisticated people. The National Institutes of Mental Health in the United States is staffed by PhDs in evaluative research often. They know all of these things, and they persist in funding the researcher themselves. There were a series of classic studies on depression, the NIMH studies of depression in the 1990s, I believe. They were absurd, literally absurd violations of the most basic sorts of expectations for good research. Attrition, all sorts of biases and the rest, and that they're routinely cited as examples of good research.
Yeah,
Something's going on.
Yeah, it seems like it's kind of got parallels there with the idea of pharmaceutical companies conducting their own research into antidepressants and things like that, I guess.
Yes, but yes, with one small difference. I think that the motives around the financial companies are financial, and what you're dealing with very frequently is the issue of fraud. That they're allowed to do that. In other words, in order to get a pill past the FDA, the government regulatory agency, you need 2 positive trials. So they can conduct 20 trials. If 2 are positive, it's going to be passed. The other is a serious file draw problem. Journals and the government and the pharmaceutical companies don't like publishing negative results. It's the same thing with psychotherapy. But psychotherapy is a little bit different. It's a very soft sort of a thing. And what it does is it encapsulates, my term, the American religion. It's the attitude toward social welfare and toward the American social stratification, the role of the citizenship, expectations of the individual. That's embedded in this. Psychotherapy is a couple of hours, and you say to the patient, you're responsible. And this supplants, it crowds out concern with the material conditions of life, the need for housing, education, jobs, and the rest. No, our solution for these things is basically psychotherapy. There's something wrong with you. If we could straighten out your head, then you'll have a good life. It makes the fundamental assumption that attitude change precedes behavioral change. And the fact of the matter is behavioral change precedes attitude change. Okay. You're in a certain situation, you adapt to it. You don't make up your mind. People are not that rational.
Well, go ahead. Yeah, well, we're gonna plow into this real deep soon. I've just got a couple of questions remaining on this this issue of psychotherapy. I guess one is that there are people that swear by psychotherapy, that they swear by the psychotherapy that they've received, and I'm just wondering how do we account for those people, of which there are many, maybe hundreds of thousands, maybe people in the millions that swear by it. Are they swearing by it based on things we may have already mentioned? Do they swear by it based on placebo, by sort of loyalty to the therapist, or are these people the outliers that it did actually work for? Like, how do we explain those people that say it did work for them?
They don't know what worked for them. They want to attribute it to psychotherapy, just like people go to a shaman and want to attribute change to them, and people go to carnival seers and who look into crystal balls and say, gee, I got a horse. She told me about a horse. I got a horse. I bet on it. They don't take a look at the role of chance or their own internal needs to identify external to themselves all sorts of things. People believe in the strangest sorts of things. Think of the virgin birth.
Yeah, well, yes, but okay. I'm going to try and challenge this and speak on behalf of somebody. So, my experience with psychotherapy is that it did. I feel it helped, but I don't feel it was the be all and end all, and especially. Like I say, in retrospect, reading people like David Smale, having the conversation I had with John Crombie, it made me realise that it's unreasonable for me to attribute it purely to my own willpower, and I'm happy to admit that. However, I've got to say, if you take somebody with say OCD, and they've at one point in their life they were. Let's say engaging in obsessive behaviours with, say, hand washing and cleanliness. And they've been to see a therapist, and the therapist, especially with OCD, as far as I know, maybe, I'm happy if you're going to call this into question. As far as I know, behavioural therapy, cognitive behavioural therapy, and specific techniques seem to be particularly effective for OCD. So I can imagine somebody who struggled with that issue saying, well, I was struggling with it, and then I went to see this therapist, and the therapist gave me a set of techniques to adopt, and by sticking to those techniques over time, 6 months, a year later, I'm in a much better place.
It wasn't the techniques. Remember, people who go to a therapist are motivated for cure, and very often the therapy is a ceremony of cure, not the cure itself. That a small percentage of people are curing themselves, and they're coincidental with therapy. This is the definition of superstitious behavior, by the way, a probabilistic association of something that doesn't cure something. You know, you scratch your ass and it rains, so you scratch your ass when you need rain.
Okay. So I guess.
You're forgetting.
Go on. Sorry, William. Go ahead.
You're forgetting that psychotherapy is a ceremony of approval in part. And people become addicted to that. They don't have enough approval in their life, and they become addicted to these nice therapists who tell them that they're wonderful. And then they go out and they say, I felt so much better. It's wonderful. I've got an alternative to therapy written about by a very fine philosopher and sociologist, Ernest Becker's Denial of Death. That book enchanted me, absolutely enchanted me. He says he doesn't know whether therapy works or not. He has no idea. He makes no claim. But what he says is everybody should have an opportunity to take a look at what they've been doing a couple of times in their life. If you will, applied philosophy. Take a look at yourself. Take a look at your behavior. And the thought is, if I remember correctly, he wanted to be part of education itself, part of education in grade school and high school, but also in university. Sit with somebody who's wise, go over your behavior, think about yourself. No promises of good outcome, but it seems like such a civil thing to do, such a sensible thing to do, so humane. It's not promising. It's offering something to somebody that's philosophically, existentially, humanistically, probably of value. Probably of value. That's all.
Right, okay.
It's not meditation. It's not a clinical intervention. It's a social utility of education.
Right, okay. So before we jump into this, I mean, this is of particular fascination to me, this idea of the religious aspect of psychotherapy. But one of the things that stood out to me in this summary was in The Illusion of Psychotherapy, William Epstein asserts that psychotherapy is probably ineffective and possibly harmful. So, I mean, this might tie into what we're going to talk about as this idea of psychotherapy as religion. But I'm just wondering if you could expand on that, because we've sort of covered how it's maybe potentially useless or misguiding, but I'm interested in why it's potentially harmful.
Okay, let's take somebody who's depressed or traumatized. And the nature of therapy is to open up their past and to bring up all sorts of extraordinarily painful situations that the therapist thinks that the patient can deal with. Some people can't deal with, and they kill themselves.
Sorry, William. That's one hell of a claim. It's understandable logically, but I mean, have we got figures on this? Studies
I'm sitting in front of, by chance, by the way, I'm sitting in front of a study that my note on the top is negative findings with an exclamation point. And the title of the study is A Randomized Trial of Dialectical Behavior Therapy in High-Risk Suicidal Veterans. And what it documents is negative effects of dialectical. There are a series of studies that document there were bad effects in the therapy group. Even though the therapy group's mean was higher, some patients really, really deteriorated, and they reported. Currently, it's nice if you report harmful outcomes that take place. So you ask me, why did the harmful act take place? Because you're opening up all sorts of painful situations under the guise of cure. Well, there's a risk always for doing these things, and one of the risks is suicide, or more depression, or a greater retreat into fantasy. How do you balance out the negative effects of therapy against the putative positive effect?
I don't know, Willie. I'm I'm taken aback by that, but only because it's not a criticism that I've run into before. I've always understood trauma as being something that the only way to deal with it is to bring it up and confront it, but in a safe environment with the right type of therapist.
I wish to point out something to you. The studies are not very convincing. There's a suspicion that many of the negative outcomes are suppressed. And the third thing is flooding, and this notion that there are competent therapists. The therapists doing the research, by and large, are probably among the very best under the greatest situations of scrutiny. In other words, they're done by university-based people who are responsible to their peers for conducting, in quotes, safe research. But most therapy is not delivered under university auspices, but in private groups and in solo practice in the community, in which you get people who have not been trained for 7 years or so, like psychiatrists and PhD clinical psychologists, but most often, they're social workers. And I know what social work education is like, and it's appallingly bad. Right. Generally, it's appallingly bad. By the way, so is clinical research in PhD stuff in clinical psychology. And psychiatrists basically are doing pilling. They don't spend all that amount of time with psychotherapy. They're more with the physical pilling stuff. You want to go into that just a second? I've got a study that's been irritating the crap out of me since my brother sent it to me. And I'll tell you the discussion that took place. Remember the intention to treat rule. Patients who dropped out are considered failures. This study was published in 2006, I believe, in the New England Journal of Medicine. And it was a study comparing the new generation of antipsychotics with the old generation of antipsychotics, and only the effectiveness of each. And there was only one finding that was reported in the study, that the dropout rate was 76% in all groups. 76% failure you're starting with the pills. That's the rule. Their rule, not mine. Their rule. There was a very famous book, and I'll use the definition, not the word, that talks about this kind of activity in a profession as being shameless self-promotion. This is a short book by Harry S. something or other, Harry S. Frankfurt. It was published by Princeton University Press. You know what the title of the book was? On Bullshit.
Right.
Truly. And the definition of bullshit is shameless self-promotion. It's worse than lying, because in lying you're acknowledging the truth by negating it. Shameless self-promotion, there's no acknowledgement of truth at all. There's our current president. That's shameless self-promotion.
And do you think well, I was going to say the psychiatry as an institution is guilty of that?
Yes.
Sort of wholesale. Would you say the same for psychotherapy and psychology?
It's worse. They don't even have the respect for physical proof that psychiatry has. There's no respect. It's all this internal stuff going on. It's just an appalling distortion of what one would consider objective coherence. In other words, science. And it goes back to the community of scholars that does this research. And the community of scholars has no respect for anything but their own self-interest. And they're given permission. They're franchised by society, who wants this, because psychotherapy is just like our religion. It's an extreme form of individual responsibility.
Well, yeah. Sorry. So I'm gonna jump directly into this in a second. I guess the one thing that's just sort of sprang up for me there was when I was talking to John Crombie about this, and we were discussing David Smale's work and his ideas of I think the book was Power, Interest, and Psychology. I think was the one we were talking about, and we talked about this notion of interest. And I don't want to misquote John, but what I took from it was that the interest, the self-interest that psychologists, psychiatrists have in the industry is more unconscious than it's conscious.
No, no way am I going to go with that one.
Okay, like I say, I don't want to misquote him, but that's what I took from that conversation. That it was more born out of that psychotherapists, psychiatrists, they're a cog in the system in the same way that the patients are, if you like, and that this idea that everyone's just trying to do the best with what they've got, but you don't.
Therefore,
you don't agree with that.
Therefore, there's no personal responsibility whatsoever. So then how do you ask the question that the heart of psychotherapy is personal responsibility of people who take no responsibility? Okay. You want to deal with that? Well, tell me how you do deal with it. How is that to be dealt with? That people who find themselves blaming this for what they're doing, as irresponsible as anything I can think of, then turn around and tell the patients that they're responsible for themselves. Either everybody is responsible or nobody's responsible. Why do the therapists get a pass on the score of responsibility, but beleaguered people who are coming into them with all sorts of material deficits in their life and social deficits, all of a sudden they're responsible for themselves. But the field doesn't say that.
One thing I've always thought, William, is, I have definitely got my criticisms of psychotherapy. Psychiatry, I don't know as much about. I'm trying to learn. It's a different field. It's a different paradigm of criticism. But especially, I don't know if you're active on social media, but watching some of the debates and the personal conduct of some psychotherapists on Twitter, it makes me completely lose faith in the system entirely, and I see it in some of the things they say, that they have not got the people that they purport to be caring for. They have not got their interests at heart. They are speaking. It's dick swinging, and it's petty ideological arguments going on, and it's pure self-interest. However, I still have to give those people the benefit of the doubt that when you go into this, when you first, you leave college and then you've got to do X amount of years at university, and you've got to go out and work in the community and learn all these things before you become a qualified psychotherapist. I have to believe that those people have got the best of intentions when they go into it, and that maybe the corruption comes in later on. But what would your view of that be? Because it almost sounds like, when I said to you a minute ago that these people were sort of the interests that they were enacting were unconscious, you sounded really unconvinced by that. And so I'm just wondering what you think about that.
Let me give you can I quote, do you remember who Rollo May was?
I'm not familiar with that name, no.
He was an eminent humanistic psychologist. He was probably the best of them all in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, really eminent. And he wrote the preface to the history of psychotherapy that was published by the American Psychological Association in 2011. Let me read you what he concluded. We in America have become a society devoted to the individual self. The danger is that psychotherapy becomes a self-concern, fitting what has recently been called a narcissistic personality. We have made of psychotherapy a new cult, a method in which we hire somebody to act as a guide to our success and happiness. Rarely does one speak of duty to one's society. Almost everyone undergoing therapy is concerned with individual gain, and the psychotherapist is hired to assist in this endeavor. This is mainstream psychotherapy, and the books that he wrote, it was the philosophic area. He hoped, and David Smale hoped too, that they could institute a personal form of treatment that expressed the desires for decent civic culture. It was a decent civic culture which motivated these people, and their desperation their unhappiness, almost their guilt, when they took a look at their field and saw it just as an extension, if you will, of the self-help industry, with the same sort of crummy self-promotion and the rest. Advertising. The research is more advertising than it is anything that's credible. It's like the selling mouthwash. It's like the test between Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola. It's bogus stuff. The truth of the matter is people don't get better because of therapy. And what it substitutes for is the material provision of a better life through government, joint action of the society itself. And it doesn't take place not because there are predators on top, but because the people of the United States do not want to share. They're not decent people.
Wow. I mean, that's one hell of a claim.
Are you aware of the history of the United States? The racial history, the class history, the rest? The degree to which profits have been concentrated on the top for the past 40, 50 years? The destruction of the public education system, the problems in public health, the homelessness problem, the reinstitution of racism in the United States, all of these different things, the lack of sharing. Yeah, it's pretty brutal. That's why I'm talking about psychotherapy as a soothing fiction. And it fits in real nice with the Lugard stuff that was written in the 19th century about, colonialism and the rest. And this is the updating of that. It's in the final chapter, because if it was the first chapter, it would seem too radical. But after going through about 250 pages of demonstration that psychotherapy doesn't work in any of its different areas, and then the deceptions all the way through this, there's all sorts of soothing fictions. Therapy itself is a soothing fiction. So is in the United States, states' rights and the rest of the thing. One of your great writers, Huxley, had a wonderful line. He spoke about dreams of order, and they always come along with tyranny. Dreams of order. Because they're sort of simplistic things that don't deal with the complexity of people. Psychotherapy is exactly that. It's a dream of order based on an extreme form of personal responsibility, self-invention. Fichte is the self-positing ego. It's Freud all over again. It's this process of rational induction. You can sit with somebody, you can reason with somebody, they're going to have an aha moment, their attitude's going to change, and then the behavior's going to change. Behavior changes when your social situation changes. By the way, this can be argued very elegantly in the area of anorexia. It's acknowledged that there's an objective test for cure of anorexia. Weight. You get on a scale and you see whether very few people are cured from anorexia. But there are changes in anorectics. Many young women stop being anorectic. What's coincidental with their change? They get out of the house. They go to college. The situation changes. They get different friends in different environments. Maybe they get a boyfriend. Maybe they get a spouse. Maybe something changes in their environment. Then they eat.
Well, you see, William, with that idea there, you see, I was going to ask you this idea of self-invention. How much of a fiction is it? Because surely it can't be a complete fiction. I mean, in that example you've just given, then, we're embodied creatures. There are certain actions that we can take. I mean, a simple example is if you've got a fraught relationship with one of your parents, an able-bodied, able-minded person can pick up the phone and endeavour to rectify that relationship and eradicate at least that one stressful element from the life. And like I said before, I'm willing to concede that my idea of personal self-invention, that I was just sort of this fountain of invention where everything around me that had changed had come from within, and that it was all totally down to me. I'm happy to concede that that's sort of an overstating the case. However,
let's make it more complicated. You cannot adjudicate rationally the difference between environmental influence and personal influence. On a metaphysical basis, you can say, well, character and personal influence is not a measurable construct. But let's ignore that for a moment and say you got two broad areas. You got environmental influence, and then you got this internal thing that's going on. You can't run the experiment. You can't run the randomized trial between different groups and put them in different situations to see what it is. You can't do it legally. You can't do it ethically. You don't even have enough money, and there are all sorts of ambiguities to it. Therefore, the argument comes down to an issue of ideology. My argument on that level is psychotherapy has failed. We haven't invested much money in changing people's environment. Let's try that a bit. That's the attraction in Hari. Not his argument so much, but when he starts talking about reestablishing social connections by providing all sorts of supports to people, then I say yes. And he just wants to talk about things like addiction. I want to talk more broadly about all sorts of behaviors and participation. And the way I get into that is by saying populations of people are basically the same. Why keep investing in the least productive? Brilliance comes from unplowed land. Let's plow with poorer groups, people who haven't been educated very well, groups of people who we haven't invested in. That's where we'll find genius. We're overspending on the middle and upper classes. We're not spending enough on the lower 70% of society. My argument is fundamentally ideological, and there's very little support for it. But the observations I'm making about psychotherapy, that's not ideological. That field has failed to produce credible proof of effectiveness over 100 years of trying.
Okay, well, just as a quick sort of side note there for anyone that's wondering, so Hari you were referring to then is Johann Hari, who's the author of Lost Connections. I actually interviewed him, I think, episode last but one or something like that, so you can go back and have a listen to that to get some wider context there. I guess, so one of the issues I even as a conservative, I appreciate and back the idea of re-establishing social connections and helping out people at the lower end of the socio-economic scale. I'm with that, especially when it's people that are in particularly bad situations. The disheartening thing I find about it, though, in the same with reading Smale, with reading Johann Hari, is that people are suffering now. People are suffering as we speak, and saying that, you know, the real problems are at a societal level, and that's what's going to improve the lot of people at the bottom of the socio-economic ladder. But as an individual, and especially as individuals that live within an individualistic society, it's kind of a damning verdict, because it's like, as an individual, it leaves you saying, well, what do I do now? What can the person do now? And I think that's maybe why one of the reasons why psychotherapy is so popular, and this idea of self-invention and personal responsibility. But also, it's, I guess, William, it's people's only option as well. You know, in the short term, you know, one's only option might be, I have to go out and try and improve my lot myself. I have to try and get my income. I have to, get a bigger income, go live in a better area, surround myself with better people. And I guess, to a certain extent, I believe that people have a certain amount of power to do that. I mean, I'm not one that buys into all this motivational bullshit about, you go out, you can do whatever you want, you can be whatever you want, and, just buy this 12-month program and you'll be a millionaire and all this crap. But I do believe that it's this message of social responsibility. It can be disheartening for people. And so when your only option as an individual is to try and improve your individual self and your individual circumstances, that however little power you can wield, it's in your best interest to do your best to wield that power. But what do you think about that?
The difference between the self-help bullshit, as you put it, and the stuff in psychotherapy is one of style, not substance. It's I think very little of that. In order to go out and make a living, for example, Trump went out and he said to people he's going to bring back industry and people are going to get, once again, middle-class wages for basically their physical labor. Well, that's not true anymore. People in the United States do not have the groups that he's talking about, the groups of concern, do not have marketable skills to make $50,000-$60,000 a year. They're lucky if they make $25,000-$30,000 with what they've got. You got just a few choices. One choice is to give them the skills to go out and get $50,000-$60,000. The second is welfare, to give them the money. Third is subsidized wages. There are some macro changes too, but they're not on the power of that. In other words, the most motivated people, the most motivated, are not going to be able to put in the heroic efforts which are necessary. They need good schooling. They need to be surrounded by people who support them. They need to be in safe communities. They need peace of mind of good families, too. We're not providing that, nor incentives for it. We don't have the community programs. We're not investing in schooling. There are many, many problems, and it costs money. It costs money. And the saving grace here is that the society says, no, it's not money. It's a question of attitude, being saved in religion. You've got to have the appropriate attitudes. It's a question of character. And then they point, see some of the immigrants who come here, they open up stores, they work very hard. Why don't the other people do it? Well, they didn't come with middle-class values, they didn't have the capital, and they don't have the skills. The skills are teachable. We don't invest in that. We invest in the blame game. We believe that by and large, American stratification is fair. Now, there always been a large minority that said, no, it's not fair, and we've got to do something. That minority has always been a minority. The great changes in the 1930s were minimal. The 1960s were superficial. And we've been going backwards from there since the high point of American social welfare in 1973. We're infinitely more wealthy than we were then, and we've got social problems up the kazoo because we've got housing problems, we've got health problems, the tuberculosis is coming back, all sorts of other awful diseases are coming back. Go ahead. I'm sorry I interrupted you.
It's when we were having our email correspondence, one of the things we were talking about, speaking about the alternative. What are the viable alternatives to psychotherapy as an idea? And the one you emphasised was caring, and I just want you, if you could just expand on exactly what you mean by that, but also if you could give a sort of practical prescription for that as well.
Let me give you two examples of it. Two very, very good examples, which I like. They come out of two different studies. One was a famous study which demonstrated, I think the study was conducted in the 1970s. The major papers were published in the early 1980s. It was the demonstration that you could take long-staying psychiatric patients from the hospital and provide them in a community setting successfully. You could provide good services to them outside of the hospital. The paper number one said it was possible to do, and it was credible. It was very credible. Paper number two said, but it costs more than hospital care. Paper number three, which was very speculative, said, well, in the long run, the social costs are less. But what the paper didn't say, and what makes the demonstration very limited, was it was conducted in a rural county in Wisconsin. The population there was basically Northern European, German and Scandinavian. And the psychiatric patients were family-oriented. They were parts of families. Families cared for them. Why did it work? Well, they had good psychiatrists, good social workers, and good nurses. But they also had families that put in an immense amount of time to make sure that their relatives, there were husbands, there were children, there were parents, could adjust to the home life. What wasn't reported was the immense unpaid cost of those family hours. So if you want to take that model of caring, which I believe works and should be, and you want to put it into the urban settings, think of how much more expensive that is than hospital care. What we did in the United States was use the study to justify closing the state hospitals, the long-term hospitals, and we opened up community mental health centers that weren't funded at adequate levels to provide adequate care. So former psychiatric patients ended up in the streets where they were immensely victimized. As bad as those old hospitals were, they provided something very important to psychiatric patients, safety. And that's not being provided now. They're out on the streets. So there's a caring function that can be demonstrated in community services for psychiatric patients. The other one I like even more. It's the Harlem Children's Zone. The Harlem Children's Zone was a high school that was set up to close the black-white learning gap in language and math. And what it did was it was a charter school. And you can't pick people for charter schools. All you can do is establish a list and then take them by probability, a lottery system. So they set up the school, and the people who registered for it and that they picked through the lottery system were poor. They were poor, and what they demonstrated over a number of years, not only did they close the black-white education gap, but their kids exceeded in math, exceeded the kids in the New York school system, exceeded the kids. It wasn't just compared to kids in Harlem, it was citywide. Wow, you say. Two things. One is it costs more, almost twice as much as public education in New York City, which was per capita at the time about $12,000. This was over $20,000. And number two, once again, it had a select population because parents had to sign up for the lottery. So by implication, those who signed up were the more motivated parents, who also put an immense amount of time with their children to make sure they came in from play, they studied, they did well in school, et cetera, et cetera. So here you have two examples. The caring function implies even more expenditures, Paul Tuff, a really fine writer who writes about the education stuff, says you don't have to the challenge is not to make parity in education. It's to spend more on education on the populations that need it. We refuse to put up the money. Obama wanted to replicate the Harlem Children's Zone, so he spoke about 4 or 5 replications for it. But can you imagine? The country's turned its back on even decent funding for education. Let alone put up all the amount of money that would be necessary to compensate for families that don't care about their children. In Wisconsin, they cared. In New York, they cared. In this school, what about all these millions of people who don't care about their children? Shouldn't we as a society protect our children first? And then you take a look at foster care in the United States. It's to puke. It's that bad. And then you take in my state, Nevada, one of the wealthiest states in the country, with the worst public school system in the country. We spend 50% of the average, if you can believe it here. There's something going on in the society that can't be attributed to the primitives at the top. There's a barbarian quality to the American people themselves. We've got what we want here, and what we want stinks. And that one of the symbols of what we've got is psychotherapy as a substitute for the Harlem Children's Zone and the experiment in Wisconsin and concern for kids and doing right by foster kid. What we've got is, I don't know what word to use, that I don't curse. What we've got is not good. And what we've got is not good is a bad character here. And it came out in this last election. Boy, did it come out.
I mean, when it comes to sort of change at a societal level, I mean, if I was to say to you, what if it's society as a whole that needs to change, and it needs to change its attitude, and people need to change their attitude towards one another, and like you say, and be more caring, put the money where the mouth is as well. You know, a lot of people profess to care about a lot of things, but you know, I think if you want to see what people believe, you've got to view the behaviour and not just listen to what they say. But I guess the problem is when it comes to if we're going to change society and so it's a more caring society, how do you bring that about in a safe democratic way? Because I mean, you know, you've got plenty of examples.
That's the question.
Yeah, that's it. You've got plenty of. Go on.
Is that ever the question? Does that ever get to it? Because the alternative is revolution. We've got a century of experience with that, maybe 2 or 3 centuries of experience with that, and those were the dreams of orders. Communism, to take over in Russia, Pol Pot, in China and Cuba and a variety of other places. That's what Huxley was writing about quite specifically, and he, by the way, included Gandhi in that. Gandhi's fascist tendencies, those dreams of order are tyrannies. And indeed, I don't know. This depressed, by the way, David Smale too. One competes. I don't know what else to do. One competes. I write, I teach, or at least I did for a lifetime. That's what I do. I am not in favor of the kind of centrally controlled change which butchers people. When you read about Stalin and Hitler and those, anything but that. No, one competes in an open society. One hopes to be able to influence people. One protects the protections of the liberal democracy. That word liberal doesn't go over real well. Well, of a progressive democracy, of an open society. It's very important. But one's also got to put up the public education to prepare citizens for it. And we're not doing that here. I
guess, do you think it's maybe just, I mean, it's a depressing sort of idea, but do you maybe just think that this hyper individuality and this sense of personal responsibility, kind of the Thatcherite idea of, you know, there's no such thing as society, there's just individuals and the families. Do you think that as sort of disheartening as it is, that maybe it's just it's an accurate enacting of basic human nature, and that maybe we don't, just at a base level, a Darwinian level, maybe we just don't care that much about each other, and if it's human nature, maybe it can't ever be overcome. I mean, I don't know.
I have no idea what human nature is. I've seen it do horrible things, and I've seen people do really magnificent things. I don't want the metaphysics. I want to stick with the shallowness of observed behavior and wondering about what it means. I don't want to go back to the arguments over what basic human nature is. It's the metaphysics of religion. Do we have a good soul or a bad soul? I think it's a bunch of nonsense in a way. It leads to sorts of meaningless things or predatory things. I don't want to impose limits on it. I want to deal with what I've got now and try and make it a bit better. And boy, is that a modest thing to say, given the direction of this society. So I push in my own way and hope that something good is going to come out of it. I don't want to kill people.
I guess, okay, so, you know, when we think about this big idea of, you know, how do we, just that idea, how do we change society? I mean, it's such a massive prospect. It's completely overwhelming to even begin thinking about it. However, sort of ironically, I guess, is there anything you would say to an individual listening to this? Because, you know, at the end of the day, society really is just we change society. It's a mass change of individuals, really. So if we can't change society as in sort of this bulk, as sort of a bulk endeavor or whatever, is there a message that you would have for individuals?
Danny, society will change. In the next 20, 30 years, one of the greatest threats that the planet has ever seen is going to take place. One of the most horrible things. We will change. And I'm talking about the effects of global warming. The oceans are going to get higher. The coasts are going to be wiped out. Oh, boy, just that. Just think of that. If the Antarctic shelf goes plunk one day in the oceans are going to go up 6 feet just by that. The rates are much faster than people anticipated. Of course, one of the bad things are billions of people are going to be displaced from the coast. One of the good things that are going to happen is that New York's going to be wiped out. I mean, New York City. That's very funny.
I get, well, I mean, there's a sort of strange irony in there in that, maybe that, all the socialist governments and communist governments that have popped up and sort of this idea of making people care at the barrel of a rifle. It's almost like, if this global warming thing pans out and the destruction that people are speculating might happen, I guess Mother Nature's going to force us to care about one another because.
Yeah, but what's our reaction going to be? Is a reaction going to be the reaction of the 20th century, a fundamentalist reaction? There's a big fundamentalist way of thinking in the United States. It's the inerrancy of the Bible. But you remember, when Hitler started becoming popular in the early 30s, people all over Europe were saying that's the direction to go, rejecting, if you will, democracy. And we needed the Führer, we needed the great leader. And this is a constant tendency in many societies not to go with popular stuff, but to go with the strong leader. And that's frightening. And that's the direction of the Trump thing. That's what came out. This fundamentalist belief, the inerrancy of the American Constitution, the basicness, the rejection of rationality, the rejection of reasonability, the rejection, if you will, of decency. Something bad happened. There's an observation that bad times make for good people, and good times, the past 50, 60 years, since World War II, has been a period of almost unprecedented harmony and growth, if you will, in the United States. And it made for extremely self-centered, in Roland May's terms, narcissistic people who really care about their fellow citizens. It's a materialism that's out of... I don't understand it almost. It's a substitute of the material world for anything that's human about it.
I've got to say, I'm sort of conscious that we're these. I mean, maybe it's matter of fact. It is what it is. But I'm conscious that we've sort of coming to the end of the interview with a very sort of an Armageddon-esque message. Is there any? Let's if we wind this back to the individual listening to this who is struggling with depression, is there anything for them worth doing as an individual, and is there any?
Yes. Definitely. If they're drinking, stop drinking. If they're sitting home, get out. Do something to change. Move. Do something. I don't have any clinical solutions for you. I don't know how I don't know what to do with depressed people. I am not a clinician. I've seen them fail. If you're overweight, stop eating. If you're not moving yourself, go out, play handball. Meet people, do something. And if they're not doing it, there's very little you can do. As a matter of fact, I've seen some wonderful community programs, community centers. Arlington County in Virginia, outside of Washington, instituted a series of community centers that's jaw-dropping. It is magnificent. That's what social work should be doing. Work out of community centers involving populations, doing the home finding, all of the rest, the material, if you will, caring functions of a decent society. We don't do that. Social work is now dominated absolutely by the clinic. I'm not sad that this interview is ending on a very down note. It should, Danny. It should. I'm not telling anything that's easy. All the people that we've spoken about that I know, David Smale, Huxley, myself, and I can mention many others, Rollo May, as they got older and older and older, they became more and more dour about things. I am in that same sort of thing. Personally, I'm not, but intellectually I sure am. The American experience is a very disappointing one. And psychotherapy is the window that I'm using to go into that disappointment. These soothing fictions we tell ourselves, they're lies. We are not solving our social problems. We're not even addressing them, Danny.
Okay, so, well, we're about to sign off here and jump into the quick fire questions, which, like you say, even though we do need to end on an honest note and not on a happy note. However, that's precisely what these quick fire questions are for, to lift us out of the doom and gloom a little bit. So these quick fire questions, I'm afraid, only available to supporters of the podcast. However, before we jump into those, is there any websites, any organisations, any projects that you'd like to make people aware of? Any links, anything like that, William?
Yes, I am an educator after all. I want people more attuned to the value of really deep, rich, loving education, which is not provided to most of our population. Not simple programs, but the deep, deep, deep cultural investments in socialization, which should take place first and foremost through public school system and then higher education. We're not doing that. That's where it needs to go, first and foremost.
Is there any actual like organisations or political movements or anything that you're affiliated with that you'd recommend people check out where that they could maybe get involved in something like that?
The Democratic wing of the Democratic Party. It's organizations like that, not little self-help groups, but it's the bigger organizations that mobilize people for these kinds of things. It's not the churches and things, but it's the superstructures of political organizations. I think people should be very, very deeply involved in those.
Yeah. Also, William, as well. I mean, you mentioned you've got a book that you're in the process of writing at the moment.
Thank you.
Yeah, Soothing Fictions, is it? But you're looking for a publisher as well. So, I mean, if you'd just like to, we get academics and I think there's a couple of people from like publishing houses actually listen to this podcast that have been in contact with guests in the past. So, I mean, if you'd just like to, put a plea out there now, or.
Yeah, that would be nice if some publishers listening. My last book was published by Oxford University Press in New York and other publishers, but this, I think, is a tough book to place. It's a piece academic, but it should be broadly of interest to intelligent readership, and I would love to hear from a publisher who wants to put it out.
Right, okay, quick fire questions. So, everybody, you get the first one free, but if you want to listen to the rest, you have to become a supporter. You won't be able to do that actually for the next week because I've shut the membership option down on the website because I'm moving over to Patreon, but I'll let you guys know when that's ready. So this first one, William, is if you could tell us the last book you read, the best book you've ever read, and then a book recommendation on this topic.
Okay, the best book I ever read is Lolita. I adore that book. That is the great American novel.
By Nabokov.
The best that I recently read was The Discovery of the Asylum by David Roth. It is a gem, and it's 200. The subject matter is 200 years old or so, but boy, does he capture stuff. And it's beautifully, beautifully written. The best book on the topic itself, which is more accessible than the stuff I write, it was written by Zilbergeld, and it's The Shrinking of America. And he holds out the hope that one piece of psychotherapy is effective. But boy, did he do a beautiful job in criticizing the field.
Right, okay. So, unlike the old quickfire questions, used to do the same 8 ones every week, we've sort of upgraded. So we've got 2 compulsory questions, but then the rest are drawn from a random selection of 50. I've got in a little cup here. I'm going to pick them out, and then we're going to see how many we can do in 10 minutes. Any you want to skip?
Okay.
Any you want to skip, just say skip. It's sort of like academic truth or dare, but there's no forfeits, only because I haven't conjured any up yet. So it's a work in progress. I will come up with some. Okay, so the first one. Oh, this is an old one, but we'll go with it. It's a good one. Outside of family and career, what investment of time or money has brought you the most joy or fulfillment? Okay folks, if you enjoyed this episode or you're enjoying this podcast in general and you'd like to help support it, there are a number of ways you can do so. You could make a one-off donation for as little as £1, or if you'd like a little something in return for your investment, just £2 a month will get you access to exclusive content, including a monthly AMA or Ask Me Anything episode. Just go to myownworstenemy.org/support. If you can't afford to make a donation, there are a couple of other ways you could help us out that won't cost you much more than a couple of minutes of your time. Firstly, you could leave us a positive review on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, as it's called nowadays. Just search for My Own Worst Enemy podcast, open the reviews tab, and then click write a review. I think that's what it says you have to do on Google anyway. I don't know, I don't use iTunes, but yeah, that's a good way of encouraging people to give us a listen. You could leave us a positive review on our Facebook page. That's always very much appreciated. Just go to facebook.com/myownworstenemy.org. You don't have to actually write a review either. If you can't be arsed, just click on 5 stars and I've done with it. Or 4. 4 stars is fine. Any less than 4, I'd rather you didn't bother, to be honest. But, it's up to you. Do what you want. If you'd rather not be so public about your endorsements, you'd rather just sort of blow smoke up my ass in a more private setting, that's fine as well. Just drop me an email, which is danny@myownworstenemy.org. Or if you're really old-fashioned, you don't do iTunes, you don't do Facebook, you don't do email, just tell somebody, good old-fashioned word of mouth, that always works as well. So yeah, that's enough validation seeking for one day, methinks. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you again next time.